And welcome back to this panel, which will focus on building IAM ecosystem and setting up a realistic implementation program.
So now if we can...
I mean, you will remember that last year the high-level conference was dedicated to the topic of innovative air mobility becoming a reality. And at the time, there was a call on the regulators to develop the right regulatory framework in a not-too-distant future. Since then, some important developments took place, and from our perspective, obviously, the adoption of the Drone Strategy 2.0, which was mentioned several times already, was an important milestone. With the drone strategy, we set an action plan at EU level to develop a thriving drone ecosystem in the European Union. We have 19 flagship actions, and not less than 5 of those are dedicated or focusing on enabling the IAM ecosystem in Europe. And I hope that the panelists will find the occasion to come back to these actions in the discussion. To discuss the issue of how to build an IAM ecosystem and to set up this realistic implementation program, we have a stellar cast of participants today. And so please welcome first Rachel Daschler, who is the Certification Director of EASA. Then we have Patrick Cipriani, the Director of Aviation Safety at the Direction de la Sécurité de l'Aviation Civile in France. Oliver Reinhardt, the Chief Risk and Certification Officer from Volocopter. Saskia Horsch, who is the Head of Global Regulatory and Public Affairs at Lilium. And finally, Tan Kahan, who is the Senior Director of the US Group of the Civil Aviation Authority of Singapore. And I would like to, in particular, applaud the efforts of Tan Ka to join us, because he actually arrived from Singapore today and he will leave tonight. So he really did the utmost to be able to be with us and have this discussion. Now, to start to the discussion, I would like to first focus on Rachel, because many of the future development or the elements of the future development of innovative air mobility are in the hands of EASA as the European regulator. So therefore, Rachel, I would like to ask you, what would be a realistic roadmap for innovative air mobility?
Thank you very much, Joachim. So from an EASA perspective, I'd like to say first that our main objective has been and will continue to be enabling and supporting the innovation and enabling it to happen in a way that that is safe and sustainable, and also in a way that is meeting societal expectations. And in this respect, we have been, as you have heard already today, quite active in trying to do our part of the work, which is mainly about putting in place the necessary regulatory framework. It's also about, for us, to ensure safety of the new types of vehicles through the certification process. So we are actively engaged in all that, also in developing the operational rules that will be needed for the first manned eVTOL type of operations. Last year we had a big milestone, which was the publication of a notice of proposed amendment in 2022, covering all the missing regulatory framework for manned eVTOL operations, and also the needed airworthiness framework for certified drones. On the eVTOL side, we are also actively engaged, as I mentioned, in type certification of a number of projects. The main ones being represented in this panel also. And yes, so making sure that the necessary standards and the regulatory framework for operations, for licensing, for the rules of the air are in place in time. That's, I would say, the core of our own mission. And this slide is giving you a little bit the the calendar roadmap as we see today for availability of the key pieces of regulation. It shows also on the right part the split between EASA responsibilities and member state responsibilities in Europe, which is a traditional split, so similar to what we see for conventional aviation. EASA in charge of the regulatory framework and aircraft certification. Member states in charge of operational certification, assessment of the vertiport when it comes to manned VTOL operations, and in charge also of airspace design, which is an important part in the picture.
All right. Well, you already mentioned the role of member states, and that's a very good entry then to get Patrick into the discussion. Patrick, France is a member state which is quite active in this, and we have already heard it several times today that the Paris Olympics 2024 are supposed to be maybe the kickoff for innovative and urban air mobility in Europe. And so let me also ask you, in your view, what is the key enabler or the most critical challenge that you are facing in France for the success of such a roadmap for innovative air mobility?
Thank you, Joachim, and good evening to everyone. The key enabler for innovative air mobility, well, I would say it's clearly safety. Safety because it has been highlighted by many keynote speakers this morning. The citizen is asking for an adequate level of safety. The operations, if the level of safety is not adequate, there will be some accidents. There are some accidents. No one will go on board. No one will want to be overflown. So it's really the key necessity, I would say. There is a consensus among authorities, at least in Europe, to ask for an equivalent level of safety as commercial air transport for those operations. This is very demanding, but I really think that it is necessary. We know that it will require certified aircraft. We know that it will require certified operations, predefined routes, and you were mentioning the step that we want collectively to have realized for next year in Paris. We have chosen to simplify or to diminish risk as much as possible, and for routes we have chosen to follow as much as possible existing helicopter routes. The challenge we see in preparing all that is to find the right balance between the requirement on the aircraft and the requirement on the operations. When we face some limitations of the aircraft, for example, endurance limitations, we have to envisage how to authorize the VTOL to land safely if it needs to. And we have to find an adequate balance between aircraft requirements and ground requirements so that this leads to realistic operations. If I have a word on air risk now, after ground risk, and still focusing on eVTOL with pilots, which is what we are working on for next year, it's interesting to look at very practical situations. We see that because we are very close to classical ATM subjects. The eVTOLs will have to follow, in many aspects, same constraints, same requirements than current classical helicopters. But we have specific constraints. We have some endurance limitation that are not shared by all classical aircraft. We have also a different way of flying, often slower, often lower, and all this has to be taken into account in the integration of these eVTOLs in the current traffic. It can pose some challenging subject around busy airports, for example. There are some other specific points that we need to progress. For example, the subject of wake turbulences, which are currently not very well, not sufficiently studied. But today, this morning, I understood that the agency is starting work on that, so that's fine. So there are some other challenges, of course, than safety. There are some challenges in business models for the operators, challenges on technical solutions. For example, the subject of standardizing some equipment, the power supply on vertiports, for example, is something that is not not sufficiently addressed yet. Challenges on UAM governance, whether vertiports will be accessible to everyone, or whether there will be a kind of privatized infrastructure. Of course, the big subject of social acceptance. All these are clearly other challenges. But to go back to your question, I really think that safety is the first one, the one we are facing today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so sounds like there's still lots of things that need to be sorted out. And therefore, let me turn to the operators here. I mean, Oliver is one of those who actually have to make that happen and will have to provide answers to many of the questions that Patrick was posing. Oliver, Velocopter has been quite active in showcasing its technology. I mean, we had the pleasure of seeing a mock-up at the EU Drone Days, but that wasn't flying, but you're also very active actually in showing people how the real flying Velocopter looks like. So let me ask you, what has been achieved so far with all these demonstrations and flight tests?
Quite a lot has been achieved, Joachim. Could you please just pass me the presenter, and I can give some slight impressions into this. So first of all, I mean, commercial flights are to begin in 2024. That's what we are targeting, that's what we are working on. And I could use now a marketing statement saying now it becomes real, but I can also use the engineering statement of now reality hits in the best sense, and it hits for all of us. Because what we were talking about throughout the last years was all imagination and how could we go there. Now it really comes to the point that we need to implement it, and now we understand the nitty-gritty details. And we just heard a number of them, also from Patrick here. Those are the elements we now need to dive into. And one of the clear things that we learned also from doing our missions in the different locations is you only can work these things together. We need to get together, all as we are here. We need to sit at the same tables at the same point in time, put them on the table and discuss them and clarify them. That's one of the lessons learned we have. Otherwise, what do we see? We've built the vertiports. We build vertiports ourselves. We build vertiports with our partners together, and we are testing the customer journey. By really testing it, by going into it, we are starting to understand where are the key points that make it acceptable for the public, for the customers to come and fly with a vehicle. Where are the potential hiccups? Yes, we fly at different locations. We fly in Paris. Maybe one nice anecdote from flying in Paris, and that's what shows also one of the lessons learned from this. Our CEO was, after the flight in Paris, talking to one of the journalists that was there. On an open rooftop bus, the journalists were sitting and watching the flight, and he was asking her, hey, what did you mean to the takeoff of the aircraft? Sorry, I have to admit, I have missed it. I was talking still with my neighbor, and I didn't recognize the takeoff. So that's one of the indicators of what does it mean in means of noise, in means of optical effects, what's happening, so that even the people that explicitly came to see it were missing it at times. So that's the things we are learning from there. We flew in Rome and also in other countries. In Rome was very special for us also, as we took there exactly the integration into the up and running airspace of Fiumicino Airport. So there the regular flights were departing, coming in, coming out. We were flying in the same airspace. We were connected to the same air traffic managers, and we were showcasing there how can we integrate this. Again, a big lessons learned. What are we taking from there? Infrastructure, yeah, we need new infrastructure. So when we talk vertiports, it's a vertiport. It's not a heliport. It can be a heliport, but it needs an additional approval to become a vertiport. It's also not a classical airfield, and it has special constraints. And we are talking about going into the cities, into the heart of the cities where land is scarce. How do we get it in there? How do we implement it? How do we implement the famous continued safe flight and landing sites? That's one of the nitty-gritty details that really is a strong lessons learned, what we need, and now then the discussion with the authorities to come to the point, how do we do it? Routes. Yeah, we just briefly heard helicopter routes. Yeah, of course we can use helicopter routes to start with, but when we really want to utilize the potential of these vehicles flying the helicopter routes, number one, we are then not deconflicting with the existing helicopter traffic, because also one thing clear, we are not replacing helicopter or any other classical aviation means. We are adding a new dimension to it. So yes, one of the lessons learned to understand what makes sense for the routes, what makes sense to operate these vehicles, to really utilize the benefits of these vehicles. Sustainability and energy. I mean, honestly, we are struggling to get charging points for electric ground vehicles and cars into the cities to get really the power demand in there. Now we are talking bringing our vehicles into the air on that end. Yes, of course, that's a challenge, and we want to use green energy. How do we do that? How do we get this? We took our lessons learned and said, we swapped the batteries to start with, so we can select when we charge them, when energy is also available. Helps a little bit on that end. But yeah, that's something we need to resolve, and we need to resolve now. 2024, we want to fly commercially. So that is one of the famous examples where we can also make a win-win with classical transport, ground-based transport, because they need the same things. And in the end, it all works, and that's a clear lessons learned from our side when we work together. None of these flights we had in the so far 8 countries, 4 continents, would have worked out if we would not be sitting together before each of the flight with all the affected stakeholders, be it the cities, be it the airports, be it the authorities, be it the air traffic controllers. They all were together at one place, and that's exactly what we see happening also today to make this a reality. And with this, yes, you mentioned it before, see you soon in Paris, then with the first commercial transports by Innovative Air Mobility.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'll watch that with interest, and we see that we hope that we will actually see you in Paris at the time you indicate, so at the Olympics. Saskia, in the drone strategy, we actually do not talk about urban, but about innovative air mobility, because we also want to cover for business models of operators who want to do something else. And Lilium is a very good example in wanting to provide regional connectivity. And so my question to you is a bit similar. So is Lilium ready to move from testing, experience, etc., to actual operations? Can we fly from Paris to Orléans after the Olympics?
Yes, so I was very interested to hear your contribution. I think we are very, very much ready to move. We're actually moving already, but we're maybe not as fast as you. We're slightly behind Volocopter, but we cross fingers that you will have great success, because your success will be our success, as I mentioned earlier today when we spoke about that. But yes, I think we have done, we've come a long way. We've had really great progress in the last year, with important milestones. There were some question marks around, is this technology actually going to work? Because it's quite novel. We're a bit different in our approach to what others in the sector are offering. And so last year we had really good milestones hit with our full wing transition, which we did with our demonstrator in Spain during the campaign. We also had just recently, we managed to fly the full speed, 250 kilometers, which is what we want to operate with our aircraft. So really important milestone to prove that this is going to work. And aside from the aircraft, of course, which is then now going through further certification progress, where we're making good progress with EASA also. It's also, we're also making progress on commercialization. So we've had, we are different to Volocopter in the sense that we're selling our aircraft. So we're traditional, we're an OEM. So we we need to find partners who want to operate the aircraft. And here as well, we've had really good momentum in the commercial side with a good order book of potential aircraft sales, with even some pre-deposits, prepayments that we've received. So I would use the marketing statement. It is very much reality. It's coming. It's here. Maybe just showing you what we are planning to do. When we start with EIS, which is scheduled for after receiving certification, which we're planning for, or which we're expecting for 25, so slightly after Volocopter. And I think it was been mentioned earlier, so it's very much, we're integrating in what is already here today. So we will have a pilot on board, and I'm not getting tired to emphasize this. We're not a drone, we're not in the autonomous space, we're really having a pilot on board, and so we're integrating into the ATM system as we know today. We're planning to operate day and night. We want to start very much in VMC, so we will use, flying according to VFR rules. We will use the routes that exist today, the VFR routes. Trying to see my slides here. It's a little difficult. We have brought 2 indicative networks that we're building, because this is what we want to achieve, right? We want to fly. Want to allow the customers to fly to locations that are of interest to them in inner cities, urban, non-urban, and for that we want to, we will need to also foresee to fly over stretches of water. So here you can see an indicative German network, and also in France how something like this would look like. We're very much in the regional space, so the operating distance that we plan to fly in the beginning, so initially is up to 175 kilometers. So you can cover some stretches. Similar to what Oliver said, we want to reduce complexity, and we want to make sure that we're ready for the time in 2 years. So if we would start building completely new big vertiports, don't think that we would probably get there. So we want to use what is already there. So integrate into airport locations and use helicopter landing sites for our purposes, as this will most likely reduce the length or the time that we need to be ready, and also the complexity. With all of this, that will inform what we need from a regulatory standpoint, because of course one thing is whether we are ready as an OEM, and whether our aircraft will be ready on time, and whether we will get certification on time. But the other thing is, is the regulatory framework ready? Because for some of these aspects, we can't operate without having, a solid regulatory framework in place. And so one area that we're looking at, and where we have been, working very closely, of course, with EASA, is the whole sort of air operations side of things. When you've seen our schedule or plans for EIS that I showed earlier, then there are things that we need to make sure we address, and we know how to operate. Like, we need to foresee for our, particularly for the longer missions, we need to know what's the kind of energy reserves we need to plan for, the kind of alternates that we need to have on our mission. So all of these rules, these kind of requirements need to be clear. We need to know in how far we can fly and how long we can fly over waters, given that some of our networks will involve flying stretches over water. We need to know what kind of licenses the pilots will need, and what's the training schedule, the training syllabus, and what kind of qualification they need. So all of these things, super important that we know them in advance. And so we're really happy that EASA started this process very early and came forward with the NPA last year, covering all of this ground. And I think we've done, we've seen great progress in this respect. Of course, there's still nitty-gritty details to discuss and to get there. And I think everyone around the table has an interest to come up with rules that are securing highest level of safety in an environment right now where we don't really know 100% yet how these aircraft are really going to operate. And at the same time, coming up with a framework that allows us to start operations soon, and be also accommodating the different business models that we have in the different aircraft types. an ask or a call from our side would be to really make sure that we get over the finish line with with the efforts that we're doing on Part AEM. It's going to be really important to have that in place so that we can actually safely operate. So that's, let's avoid any kind of delays. On the infrastructure side, as I said before, we want to utilize what is there. I think here again, EASA has done a great job in coming forward with a first set of rules last year. They're non-binding, but they've given a great basis also for national authorities to have some guidance, because in our interactions with authorities, we've seen kind of hesitance to move forward on the basis of the existing rules that we have today. So the PTS that was released last year, although it's non-binding, has given, I think, a lot of security and sort of guidance to authorities. We have seen some member states moving forward really quickly in terms of adapting their rules, so particularly France. So we were really happy to see that the rules for permitting for helicopter landing sites were adapted to eVTOL, and that's, of course, going to make it really easy, or not easy, but it's going to make it straightforward and clearer to go through permitting procedures for landing sites that are also suitable for eVTOL. So that's been of great help. We are now seeing that other member states are slowly moving into this direction as well. So there's Germany, who's just in the process of creating a task force to bringing everyone together, and I guess infrastructure will definitely be, I'm hoping, part of this of these discussions. I think Spain is also looking to revise their infrastructure rules. So I think it's all going in the right direction. From our perspective, this is actually what we need. We can get infrastructure up and running on the basis of the rules that exist today. It requires a bit of creativity from the authorities, but I think based on the PTS that we have, the rules in ICAO and the existing national rules for helicopter landing sites, it should be feasible to adapt existing infrastructure. Moving to airspace integration, which is the other part that we obviously need here. As said before, we're integrating into something that exists already. I think there's one area where we see lots of complexity at the moment. This is in particular where we want to integrate at busy airports, because what we want to make sure is that our operation does not in any way impact runway throughput. And we also want to make sure that we do not place additional burden on ATC. So that means we kind of want to ensure we have a space where we can operate independently and simultaneously to runway operations. And that, of course, requires, and you look into the rule book and you're like, okay, there's different, there's rules for helicopters, and then there's rules for parallel runway operations. Which ones do apply? I think here as well, we can, together with the regulators, with everyone around the table, find solutions that work on the basis of the existing rules. I think further on in the development, adaptations will be required, but based on the rules that we have today, I think, and a little bit of goodwill, and maybe clarifications from EASA, which we have in one or two very practical examples, it can actually work to have clarifications here to make it happen also in very complex environments such as airports. And so to conclude, I think we're on a really good path. I think there's great willingness everywhere to make it happen on time. I think we need to all, as has been mentioned already, continue to collaborate, because just OEMs will not make it. We really have to work together very closely, and we have to not let loose, because it is tomorrow, the start of operations.
Okay. Well, so far we had a rather European perspective, so you will be able to fly from Charles de Gaulle to La Défense. You'll be able to fly from Toulon to Antibes. I'd rather do the latter, I must say. But let's see what's happening somewhere else. Huh? So we are lucky to be in the presence of Tan-Kah, and so I would like to ask you, from the Singapore perspective, what is the key enabler? What are the most critical challenges that you are facing in your way to innovative air mobility.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me and for EASA colleagues, and thank you very much. I was here last time, 2018. It was in this setting as well. When the first drone high-level conference was here, we were talking about small little drones, and now we are talking about UAM in the space of 5 years, and it was quite a dramatic change. I would say 2 points. The first is I agree with my colleague from France. Is safety is really the key one. When I started to look at the IAM, when you say the innovative air mobility ecosystem, I started to go into the chat GPT to say, first type aviation ecosystem. What's the difference between aviation ecosystem and AAM ecosystems? By and large, are quite similar with some distinctive differences. For example, the distinctive differences in the aviation ecosystem is airport, but in the IAM or AAM space, it's infrastructure. There are a lot of traditional stuff, but in the ChatGPT, other stakeholders such as school, such as research institute, and so on and so forth, are a little bit different. So from the safety side, I totally agree. I think we need to get a handle of that because that has linked to the public acceptance. So I would say safety from few perspectives as well. One is internal to CAS, the other one is external. Internal to us is that we are a very small country. We are not a state of design. We are state of registry and state of operator. So we rely a lot on the state of design to set all the standards. We will work with whichever the state of design, whether in this part of the world, EASA, in across the pond with the FAA, whoever else on the state of design side. But internally for us, it's important is that because it's a novel technology, how do we build up our own capability in this particular space? We are not a big aircraft, we don't manufacture aircraft. So some of the space that we need to build up. The second part, I would say external perspective will be that though Volocopter has a vision to try to fly that within Singapore, but within Singapore it's a very small space. I say that same thing last year when I was here. There's no point for Volocopter to fly within Singapore. And anytime you go above 35 kilometers, it's out of Singapore, it's somewhere else. So it is in another country's airspace. So we really needed the international, some form of harmonization. I think ICAO heard about it. ICAO in Assembly 41 is working through some working group to try to steer this development or this path forward such a way that we can harmonize the regulation. So then from a state of registry and state of operator and from the OEM, they will be very happy because they can sell in many parts. So that's on the safety side. The rest, I totally agree with Rachel as well as what Patrick has said. The other aspect of challenges that we face would be, I would say, not so much on regulatory perspective, but rather from the government perspective. For us as a small country, if I were to locate a plot of land for the purpose of vertiport, then for us, that plot of land is very, very important. Why should we allocate it to, say, vertiport and not for another part of the competitive economy to develop factories, for example? Why should we do that? So that once we set that in place, just follow from this morning, Paul and Patrick and the Excellency Hololei was talking about. The common vision, once we have that, then we are a little bit different in a sense, small country. We do a whole of government approach to link everybody together, whether is it the police side, whether is it the military side, our side, and we bring it together to try to facilitate this. So the infrastructure side of the house is much easier to manage. But we need to get alignment within all of us, that a common vision. And that was a little bit of challenge that we have initially. But once we set it up, I think it is much easier space for us to work. And I think it will be easier for Volocopter or whoever else want to come to Singapore. And that is our value proposition. So I will stop there. So I kind of framed that out in a few areas about government side, industry side, school side, others. The other aspect is a different, this is not so much on the regulatory side, it's about investment, funding side of the house. And I think that one, industry got to take care of it. We can take care of it. So I hand back to you, Dr.
Okay, thanks. Just to say before we go on that we also want to take questions from the audience, and so Slido will also be used in that session, so don't hesitate to type your questions, and at one point I will also hopefully be able to see them on the screen to select the best ones. But before we do that, let's stay for a moment at one point which I saw on the slide of Tankar, and that's the issue of social acceptance. I mean, this is something which features very prominently in the drone strategy, something that we heard in previous panels, but still is a practical issue. And obviously I'd like to hear from Singapore, but before we do that, let's maybe ask Patrick. I mean, how do you ensure that in France? How do you engage with local communities? How do you ensure that there is buy-in from people who may actually not want to fly from Charles de Gaulle to La Défense?
Maybe one first aspect is the approach for noise. And on this specific point, we are doing trials in the Pontoise airport. We are doing measures. We will continue to work on that, modeling the noise impact. And the current, even if it's only partial results, the current results are very encouraging. Very encouraging because it shows that the noise emergence on landing points will not be at all. There is no emergence compared to the nominal noise. So this is a good point for social acceptability. If your question is more on the how to involve local authorities, yes. We are making a very progressive approach. Currently, we have already schemes in place that deal with the creation of classical helicopter heliports or heli surfaces. All these already involve local authorities. They ask for some environmental impact studies. There is already a national process, in fact, to be sure that there is some discussions with the local authorities on these types of infrastructure. And we are following the same path for dealing with vertiports. So it's a first phase for us to gain experience collectively. We do not know up to now if we will need something very different in the future for vertiports.
Okay. Now, Singapore. What do you do in order to...
I would say it's, for public acceptance, it is not just the role of the government. I think it's a lot of the role to do the role of the industry as well. On this note, I must say, Volocopter did a very good job. They actually have a mock-up in one of the schools. The Institute of Technical Studies, they put a nice mock-up there so that the students can learn about it, can play with it, and the community can go and see for themselves what this aircraft is all about. Government can do as best as it can, and the government role is really to assure the public that this thing that fly over your head, we have gone through the due diligence, which address back on the safety side of the house. That's why I kind of say safety has direct implication to public acceptance. And government can, the regulators can say that, and can say that, you know, we have done all the due diligence that we could, but equally important is the industry to sell that same message. It is not just about commercial, but safety is important part of the role that they play. And I think in the Singapore context, I think we work quite closely with, in this case, Volocopter, because they're going to launch it and they put an aircraft in one of the schools to get the people to play with it, and I think that's a useful part.
Now, when I look at Slido, there are currently two questions, and one is about the need for harmonizing regulations globally. I mean, we heard at the grand opening that ICAO is getting interesting in all this, and they set up a study group, but is there really such a need, and how urgent is it, Rachel?
So yeah, I guess there is a need because it's the third time I'm coming to this conference, and each time we tend to change the terminology since the time before. We have tried to propose a comprehensive terminology set in the last NPA we have issued, distinguishing between types of operations on one side and the types of vehicles also, because you have the aircraft and you have the type of operation. So we need clear terminology for both. I think our latest NPA is doing quite a reasonably good job, but if there is a need to evolve a little bit and to standardize further, I'm sure that we would be very open and flexible on that. So now we are talking about manned eVTOL, for example, or manned VTOL for the type of aircraft. We are talking about innovative air services, which includes innovative air mobility inside. I think we need to acknowledge that there is a growing variety of potential use cases and types of operations that have each their specificity and their safety needs, which can be slightly different. So that may explain partially the different terms also that we have been using.
Mm. Now, there's another set of questions, actually two of them, which focus a bit on the business case. And so I would like to get back to you, Oliver, and to you, Saskia. And the first one is saying, well, it's nice to say that safety is a key enabler for innovative air mobility, but to make a business case, there have to be other enablers, time saved, etc. And somebody else is asking more on the cost side, well, how do you actually think you will have a profitable business if there is a pilot on board? Who wants to start?
That's indeed a good question to look into that element, and very clear, making out of this a profitable business is no walk in the park. And very clear also, it does not function in every place around the world, in every city where you go. In our case with the urban mobility, there are clearly cities where this makes much, much more sense than in other cities. We are adding a new dimension to the transportation. And that new dimension to the transportation makes sense where you really have a challenge on the other modes of transportation. And that is then where really the time advantage kicks in. But then the next element is you need to build it up in a network that really makes it run smoothly, continuously, that all those investments that I mentioned before on the infrastructure side, on the charging side, on the routes definition side, that all this starts to pay off so that you really have a chance to get a certain volume into it. So that means, yeah, we need to have these enabling factors in place. And then, indeed, it turns out that it makes sense, that it makes economic sense, that it makes environmental sense, also clearly keeping in mind what we are doing here, Lilium, us, our other peers on the market. We are getting a mode of transportation here to the cities that is directly emission-free in the cities. Okay, now you can say, I can sit into my electric car and drive the same route. Yes, you can. But in the end, that's where the time saving kicks in, where the stretch of the route you're traveling kicks in. Indeed, these types of vehicles are still less on energy needed, on emissions generated when going onto these same routes from the same location to the other location, comparing to when you're ground-based traveling around a lot of places in order to get there. So that's all that needs to get together. And yes, it's no straightforward thing, and that's one of the things that we all have to master from the industry side. We need to look very carefully, our product that we are having, where does it fit the needs, where does it pay off, and then we also can offer it at affordable ticket prices, which again is then another factor on the societal acceptance. It doesn't work if we do something that only a few people can afford. It only works when we can do it at a price tag that many of the people can afford.
Mm. Okay, Saskia, I guess you have the advantage that, at least from the outset, you have more passengers than one sitting next to your pilot, whom you have to pay. But what other key success factors do you look into in order to make this a profitable business?
Yeah, no, exactly. I was going to add to this. I mean, we're in the regional space, right? So if you look at the vision that we have, which is putting 6 passengers on the aircraft and having a scheduled flight. You know, you look at full capacity of the aircraft, then you can make it. Then you will eventually reduce the price per passenger seat if you manage to build something up like this. Of course, we will first start smaller, right? There will be higher price points in the beginning, as we are moving into this new space where there's no ecosystem yet, no demand yet. So, like with any other invention, you know, prices will be high in the beginning, which is also why we decided to enter the market more in the, focusing or addressing the general and business aviation space, where there's less price sensitivity. People are more willing to pay higher prices in the beginning. And where it's like more B2B operation, which we think will also help with acceptance, right? So you start slowly, you start in areas where you don't really adding to the noise. We will fly from airports to existing helicopter landing sites, which then will be usable for eVTOL. And so starting small with a customer base that is less price sensitive will help us to actually access the market and to then scale up over time, to then move into the mass commercial market, which is ultimately, the idea is to replace the regional routes that you have now with airlines, which we can do then in a sustainable way. So I think there is a clear, for us at least, and the customers that are now buying our aircraft, a clear business case. Also, helicopters today cannot fly in inner cities. When you look at Germany, for example, there's almost no helicopter business at all because the noise requirements, the noise limitations are very strict. And so we think that with our new model, with looking at the low noise profiles, we will be able to open up new routes that today do not exist and are not being served or cannot be served by helicopters. So I think there's a clear case to be made.
Okay. Now there is. Let's go back to Slido, and there's a question linking up to this integration with urban transportation, and that is to you addressed, Patrick, I think, which is how are French authorities concretely supporting eVTOL operators versus ground transportation systems for the Olympics, in addition to providing landing sites?
Well, at the Olympics horizon, we see that as a start. I mean, it's not a cruise situation where we will have eVTOL passenger transportation throughout the area, many sites. No, it's a start. I think it can be a very significant and interesting start, but it's a start. So we are not making any competition or making any privileges for these operations. We just want to enable them to happen. And this is already something challenging, so let's focus on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, now a question, I guess, to you, Rachel, which is, there is somebody comparing the FAA approach, 2117B, making special airworthiness requirements for each model. And the question is whether EASA plans to harmonize standards between authorities. So let's take it a bit wider and talk about how you see the interaction with, in particular, obviously the FAA as one of the leading other certificating authorities in relation to airworthiness standards for innovative air mobility.
Yes, thank you for the question. It's a top priority for us to move towards harmonization of eVTOL certification requirements with the FAA. And we have been, it's now close to 1 year from now, invited the FAA to work together with the specific tasking of trying to converge at least on some of the most critical technical requirements, certification requirements. And we are actually actively working right now as we speak on that. And I'm hopeful that within a few months from now, we should be able to have some achievements in terms of aligned requirements on some critical topics. At least that's a clear objective that both administrations have set to ourselves, and our teams are working together at the moment, trying to find common grounds on important things such as battery fire protection requirements, or how to consider the requirement for continued safe flight and landing, and other important technical aspects.
Okay. Well, we're coming to the end of the panel, and I would like to conclude with one quick round with all the panelists, and the question is the following. I mean, imagine it's March 2024, and you're sitting at the Amsterdam Drone Week, and you have again been invited to this panel. What is the one thing that you wish would have been solved or advanced to a large degree from today until the next panel when we're sitting here? Let's start with our guest from Singapore.
But I guess it's, as I said, from a state of operator and state of registry perspective, is some form of approach to try to get the convergence of the regulatory standards. Okay.
Saskia?
On the spot, I would say I hope that next year we'll be able to say that a few vertiport approval procedures are already on their way, being assessed and in good shape to be approved soon.
Soon from the perspective of next year's conference.
From next year's conference.
All right. Oliver.
Yeah, I think the item that I wanted to mention, we just heard already, and that's exactly one of the things that I clearly also would like to see, that we are not talking anymore about how we are reacting to what the other authorities are doing, that we really come to a joint advancement of what we need to get this into place. It's an international industry, it's an international marketplace, it's an international aviation, and especially the triggers that we are seeing also from ICAO side now to start to get the authorities together to discuss these issues can be great platforms, and hopefully next year we just recognize, wow, we've made a huge step forward, and now we are talking about the same thing with the specifics of the individual countries. Of course, we will always have this, which makes sense, but we're talking in the same sense, in the same direction, and we have joined forces.
Okay. Patrick?
Well, not to say the same things as my colleagues, I would say I would take a much more closer, practical attitude, and I will be willing to be able next year to say that we have finally set up the conditions to be able to start commercial operations on eVTOL passenger transportation in the, let's say, the following month.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Rachel?
Yeah, I think I would like to see us in the final phase of the first certification.
Okay. Well, so I think we have a very concrete and clear wish list of the different panelists, which I think reflects quite nicely the different aspects of the roadmap to IAM that we discussed. I mean, we need to advance on a number of very practical issues. We need to ensure more global convergence and a clearer path towards an industry which indeed, if it wants to grow at scale, needs to be able to operate on a global level and not be subject to very specific local conditions. And we also need to do that with keeping the main objective in mind, which is to offer safe and affordable transport to all citizens involved. With that, I would like to conclude the panel and invite you to join me in a round of applause for our panelists.